G'day, Dave here again. We're at this point, this is where we left off, I think, looking at the legislation in more detail. So I'm going to come back to this. I'm looking at part 2, health and safety duties. So this is legislation, looking at the legislation in 2015, and it's part 2 of looking at the legislation video clip that'll go up onto YouTube. That's where you should be seeing it now. So I'll get rid of this one, that's the last one, and I'll show you how I got to the legislation itself. And that's at the top of the page of the Work Health Safety Law and Risk Management site. And we look at Work Health and Safety Act, just down there. Take a little while to come up, and then you will see that you can click on the PDF document that's there, and it says current PDF document. That's the best one to go for because they always keep them current, and then it'll flick itself up and you'll see the device there, the page in your browser that you can then go through. But now I'm going to take that off for a minute while I go back to a document I've got here, which is in fact just a PDF document of the Act, but not seen through the browser. So nothing different, it should be exactly the same. So we had a little look at the object before, what the object of the Act is, and I always think it's a good idea to go back to the object initially and say, to make some sense of it. Main object of the Act, I'll just highlight that. So the main object of the Act is to provide for a balanced and nationally consistent framework to secure the health and safety of workers and workplaces. And then it goes on, so that's a main object, and then this is how you do it, by protecting workers and other persons against harm to their health, safety and welfare, through the elimination or minimisation of risks arising from work or from specified types of substances or plant. Now, just in case you don't know what plant is, it's machinery, and substances are sort of, can be anything from a gaseous substance to a liquid or a solid substance like asbestos. So, it's a pretty broad church, basically. It provides that. And then it goes on, and this I think is very interesting. I would consider this probably the single most important statement. But how you achieve that statement is also in the social organisation of work, which is all of these ones down there. Okay, so all of the subsections. So if you go up the top, Division 2, 3. Division 2, subsection 3, 1A, B, C, D, E, F, G. A really talks about, I'll stop moving around. A talks much more about the basic principle of what you're trying to do it, and B, C, D, E, and F, and G, and in fact even H, should include H as well, maintaining and strengthening the national harmonisation of laws relating to worker health. These are all procedures that need to be done, processes, if you like. And then it's got a kind of nice motherhood statement here, often used. It says in, so we're looking at Division 2 object, subsection 3, and we're looking at subsection 3.1 for this one, or subsection 3.2 for this one. So this is 2 here. And in furthering subsection 1A, which is the one we see as the really important one, protecting workers from persons against harm and to their safety, blah, blah, blah. In furthering section 1A, regard must be had to the principle that workers and other persons should be given the highest level of protection, against harm to their health, safety and welfare from hazards and risks arising from work or from specified types of substances or plant. And then it says, as is reasonably practicable. And I want to concentrate a bit on that this time if we can. So I'm going to put it up here in my search engine for it. That'll search reasonably practical under the Act. And you'll immediately see that at the very beginning of the Act, I'm looking at version 2 2015 here, the very beginning bit, it'll highlight what is reasonably practical, subdivision 2. So this is just before the primary duty of care statement, which we've just looked at before in the last one. This is under the very basic principles, subdivision 2, what is reasonably practical. What is reasonably practical is subsection 218, so it's division 1, subsection 1, the principles that apply to the duty. See, this is, I don't know if you can see this properly or not, but in part 2, health and safety duties, we've looked at a few of these, but these become incredibly important, and I'll go back through the ones that are blue there in a minute, but I want to get to this thing, what is reasonably practical, because that's such an important thing. Now, if you've got it as a PDF document downloaded, just click on it, it'll take you to that subsection to expand it. Okay, so subdivision 2, what is reasonably practical? And it says, and this is a very interesting piece of thinking that goes on. What is reasonably practical is ensuring health and safety. What is reasonably practicable in ensuring health and safety in this Act? Reasonably practical in relation to a duty to ensure health and safety. So we know we've got a duty established to ensure health and safety, means that which is, or was at the particular time, reasonably able to be done in relation to ensuring health and safety, right? So it's got to be something which is reasonably able to be done, not something that could have been done but was extraordinary, taking into account, weighing up all relevant matters. And then it gives you a bunch of relevant matters. So, how would you use this in application? And I think this is quite interesting in terms of, well, I'll tell you what. There's an interesting thing going on here at the moment with people, the anti-vaxxers, where they're turning around saying people should vaccinate their children against whooping cough and measles and mumps and polio and things like that. And there's a bunch of people saying, I don't want to do this to my children because I'm not sure of what the science is on it. That's entirely fine. Everybody's got a right to question science. They should question science without a shadow of a doubt. However, there appears to be very little, if any, evidence that what they were initially worried about, that vaccines were causing major problems with children in their intellectual growth as well as their social growth, that seems to be not the case given the science. But look, I can't be dead sure that that's the case or not. But so what would my obligation be under the Act to ensure, for instance, that my children were vaccinated so that when they go to my workplace and they're looked after in a creche or whatever you like to call it, or a preschool or something like that, that they don't infect other children with diseases which they're not immune to. They don't have an immunity to. There's something about what they call herd immunity, which is problematic with a lot of these things, that you've got to have a large percentage of the population immune to it in order to stop it from spreading. So anyway, we'll look at that. Let's think of it through that gaze, because it's a very current and sort of interesting topic at the moment that people are talking about. Okay. Well, what have I got to do as a person who supplies a workplace, who lives in a workplace, operates in a workplace? What has that workplace got to do that's reasonably practical in relation to a duty to ensure health and safety? Well, first of all, we can say that it's got to be judged at a particular time. It either is or was at a particular time reasonably able to be done in relation to ensuring health and safety. So we'd be talking about vaccines. Would vaccines reasonably be able to be done in relation to ensuring health and safety? Yes. Taking into account and weighing up all relevant matters, including, now here's a big one, including what? And this is where it starts to flesh out what reasonably practical is. The likelihood of the hazard. So here we are here, starting with A, the likelihood of the hazard or the risk concerned occurring. How likely is it that if I, as a workplace, allow children who are not vaccinated to come and be in the creche or to come to work, or even employees, for instance, who are not vaccinated against mumps, and you can get them. I got, what the hell did I get? I think I got mumps when my children were young. My children are in their 30s now. So I can't remember exactly what happened, but I do remember having chicken pox, which is pretty bloody awful, and I'd never had that before, so I got it as well. And people used to take their kids around to a place which one of the kids had had chicken pox on, so that they could expose them and get immunity before they grew into adults and got chicken pox as an adult, if I remember rightly. Let me just have a look. Okay, just went back to have a look to see if that was working all right, and it appears to be, so I'm going to open this up to double page. I don't want it on a double page. That'll do. That might be big enough to see. I've got a, hang on, I'm just going to show you this. It's a bit funny. My desktop is a duck looking in from outside a plane window. I've got ducks like that at home, so they crack me up. Sorry about that. Just had to show you that. Okay, we'll make this wider, make this bigger. So I want to make it big enough for you to be able to see all right, but not so big that you can't fit it on your screen, kind of thing. So we were looking, we'll go back again, we were looking at what is reasonably practical. And it says that in this Act, so this is a definition section, very, very clearly a definition section, reasonably practicable in relation to a duty to ensure health and safety means that which is or was at a particular time. So it's and they have to. You've got to be a little bit careful. Like it means that that which is or was at a particular time reasonably able to be done in relation to ensuring health and safety. Now, for instance, I'll give you some examples of things that weren't particularly possible at a particular time. Well, one of the things which interests me is airbags on cars. Now, these things are very good at preventing pretty major face trauma, which used to happen a lot with car accidents. But the technology for airbags just wasn't around in the 1960s or 70s, as far as I remember. Now, if you bought a car that didn't have airbags, people would wonder what the hell you were doing. You know, they're just a de rigueur. They're always there. They're in the thing, and there's been some problems with that. With a lot of cars having their airbags recalled in the States, up to millions of different models have had to be recalled because it turned out that some of the airbags would go off in such a way that they would actually injure passengers. So that's just a little example of something which at a particular time wouldn't have been reasonably done in relation to ensuring health and safety for drivers, but now is. Which is right now reasonable to be done in relationship to ensuring health and safety. So if you've got drivers out on the road on your organisation, what is reasonable in terms of cabin safety, for instance, would be a very important point about whether it was reasonably practicable to apply that cabin safety measure. And it may be even just something like, pre-tensioning of seatbelts may need to be fitted in cabins that don't have them. If there's such a thing, and there probably is. But then it goes on. It says, okay, what do you take into account to determine if something was reasonably practical or reasonably able to be done in relation to ensuring health and safety? Well, here's some factors to weigh up, and these factors are the real crux of it, okay? So let's just deal with A first. A is the likelihood of the hazard or the risk concerned occurring. Well, now, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Obviously, what's really being said here is if you've got the hazard, don't forget the difference between a hazard and the risk. In a sense, a hazard is what happens, and the risk is what likelihood of it happening is. How likely is it? If you picked on something let's say you were doing a guillotine, you had something which cut paper to size in a large office environment. Quite often they'll buy their paper in bulk, and then they'll cut it to they used to anyway, cut it to A4 size and so forth. So they had these big things called guillotines that were very, very sharp knives that could cut paper extremely accurately, and they would buy paper in bulk and cut it up to the sizes they wanted. I'm probably going back quite a few years here. In fact, I know I'm going back at least 35 years when I worked on one, on a guillotine. But that had, you'd ask the question, what was reasonably practical? Well, one of the things we had was, on the guillotine, was that you couldn't operate the guillotine without both your hands being stretched far out to your side. You couldn't get them anywhere near a knife without the guillotine operating. Now, some of the older guillotines had foot operation pedals, and so you could actually your fingers could be in the way, and people would lose bits of their hands and fingers all the bloody time in those. So I looked at it and said, what's the likelihood of the hazard or the risk occurring, concerned occurring, which is losing bits of your body parts, and that was reasonably likely. So the only reasonable preparation, what was reasonably practical, was to make a switch system that made it so it was impossible to operate the guillotine while your hand was anywhere near the blade. Just totally impossible. They even have now these fantastic saws that, where you've got a saw blade sticking up through a bench saw, that actually short the blade out. If your finger goes anywhere near it, if your finger touches the blade, it has a lightning fast reaction that the blade drops down and you can't get cut. But it can tell the difference between wood and fingers, which it does through electrical resistance or something like that. Now that's now stock standard. You can go down to Bunnings and buy one of these blades. So there really is, one could argue, very little. If you were not to fit this to a standard blade in a factory, a safety system like this to a standard cutting blade that comes out of a bench that you're running, say, wood or plastics or whatever it is over it, if you didn't do that, and the likelihood of the hazard or risk was obviously high because you're running your finger over, bloody great things that cut great big chunks of wood, then you wouldn't have met the reasonably practicable level, because it wouldn't be expensive to do it, wouldn't be difficult to do it. And then you take into another thing. It says, what about, with this particular blade, the drop down blade, the degree of harm that might result from the hazard of the risk. Well, holy shit, if you chop your fingers off, the degree of harm is seriously bad. You're not just going to get a bruise or something like that. In fact, it's quite interesting because it's difficult to, and I don't want to make all this very complex, but I want to just throw in a bunch of ideas for you to get a feel around. A friend of mine a couple of days back, I rang her up and she said, I'll ring you back when I get home. Didn't get a phone call when she'd been home for a while, so I rang her the following day to find out. And she'd gone to a rather large supermarket, and what had happened was she was going to buy some stuff. She was walking around with her adult son, who happens to work at the supermarket there, so she'd get a discount. And she's a lady of she's not sort of small and light, so falling over was a major problem for her. And she slipped on some liquid that was on the ground. And fell over and really badly bruised her arm. Now, it's a bruise, it's no big deal. She didn't break anything, but she did spend 4 hours in hospital getting it x-rayed to see that there was no break. And it turns out that she's, in a couple of weeks' time, is off to Europe for a period of 3 months, where she's supposed to be looking after an elder aunt, to do her last trip back to Europe. Now that's a big, that's a serious problem for her, that bruise now. And if there was any long-term result out of it, which there may well be, and we probably won't know for another few months yet, that would be a really bad thing. So the degree of harm that might result from the hazard or the risk is not always necessarily linked to what you think of when you look at the hazard itself. So just a little bit of sort of, slippery substance on the floor, and what they'd done is, because the night fill staff were in doing the fill of the shelves, I think, and what had happened was they'd come across this spill, and then they had gone off to get a sign that said watch out for the spill while they were cleaning up the spill. But so the spill was left unmarked for the period of time it took them to go and get the sign. I think that's very poor that was the case. They should have left someone there and called out, to get someone else to get a sign so that they could stop people from walking along it. So I think they didn't discharge their duty of care there. There was a duty of care, but they didn't do what was reasonably practicable. It was quite obviously reasonably practicable to get someone to stand over the liquid and wait until somebody else got hazard signs, and then the team could come in and clean it up. Anyway, they didn't do that, so they would be in breach. So you've got to take into account the degree of harm, but the trouble is that different people for the same hazard will have a different degree of harm. Older and infirmed people falling over can result in breaking a hip. If it was some sort of young person who's fit and healthy, falling over may not even result in a bruise. But you have to take your victim as you find them in law. So if the person is frail and that it's, they're on your property and they're there as a licensee, they're actually paying to be in there, at least, or as an invitee to come in and have a look, that's a high standard of care. And so you've got to be sure that you do have these systems in place. So the degree of harm that might result from the hazard of the risk, and let's look at C, what the person concerned knows or ought reasonably to know about the hazard of the risk and the ways of eliminating or minimising the risk. Now that's an interesting one. So So you've got to take into account, let's go right back to the beginning of it again, what is reasonably practical. You've got to weigh up all the factors, including the likelihood of the hazard and the risk occurring, concerned occurring, the degree of harm that might be suffered with the risk, and what the person concerned knows or ought reasonably to know. So it's not enough to say, gee, I didn't know. You may be considered to be ought reasonably to have known that, whether you did or not known. It's what's known as an objective test rather than a subjective test. And that applies to the hazard or the risk and the ways of eliminating or minimising the risk. Now, very occasionally you get a situation where this one is challenged. What the person knows or ought to have known. There's a case that goes back, it's quite a while back, it'd be about 70 years back or more probably, just after the Donoghue and Stevenson type of tort case was put up. And I think it was called Roe in the Ministry of Health, if I remember the right citation for it. And it might have been about 1940 or 50 that it happened. Anyway, what it was this. They used to do, and some of you probably have had one of these, they used to inject a what do you call that stuff? Anaesthetic into your spine. It was a spinal, I was going to say spinal tap, but it's not spinal tap. They're just a good group. Anyway, it was there's a word for it, and people often have them when it's a sort of what they call a block or spinal block or whatever, so that the idea is that you don't feel anything from where you put the anaesthetic in down. So it's very good for women having babies as a way of stopping the pain involved in it, but they can still be aware of what's going on. It doesn't affect them mentally. They can see what's happening and so forth, but without feeling it. Anyway, in this case, what had happened was the pharmacy at the hospital, or the people who made the anaesthetic, or this sort of local anaesthetic that you injected into the spine, had done what they normally did, which is to put it into these little glass vials. That's how they used to keep them, and they would, so they were perfectly sterile and everything was 100% no problems. So they were really taking care, to avoid any hazard of the pollution of the liquid that you're going to use, because that would have been pretty disastrous. And they put them in these little glass vials, and then the idea is that you would take it and break off the top of the vial. You've probably seen this if you've been around as long as I have. Not that I've been around that long, but 60 years. I've seen a lot of change in medicine, and these used to be the way that they would always draw stuff up. These days it's stuck into a rubber sort of cap thing that's there that works really well, but in those days you had to break the top off and so forth. And then you'd suck this stuff up into the anaesthetic into a needle, and then you'd poke it into the person's back, and everything would be fine. Now the trouble was, what they didn't know was that the particular type of, the process that they used to make the vials had left some microscopic cracks in them. Well, that wouldn't have been a problem, except for the fact that they were stored in, I think, formalin. Formalin, it's a sort of a preservative, essentially. So what would happen is that the vial would be made, the little glass vial would be made, and then that would be filled up with the anaesthetic, and then it's for a spinal block, I think it was called. The anaesthetic, and then they would be placed again in another glass container which is filled with formalin, I think, in order to ensure, the whole idea being that it was, that you didn't get any infection in it or didn't get any other substance. The unfortunate thing was that unbeknownst to them, these microscopic cracks let a bit of the formalin into the what do you call it, the anaesthetic. And the consequence was there were about 4 or 5 patients who ended up paralysed as a result of getting these spinal blocks from this. I think it was that. And one of them was Roe, and she sued the Ministry of Health and said, look, you should have been aware that what you're doing was a tort. It was your negligence in doing this had been obvious, because had you done it properly, I wouldn't have ended up this way. You wouldn't have ended up, with I think she was paraplegic, just waist down. Just waist down, like that's not no problem, but no, it is. So she ended up suing. What was interesting was that the court in that case was faced with a similar sort of statement about the law, although this has been put here in the legislation itself. What the person concerned knows or ought reasonably to know about the hazard of risk and ways of eliminating and minimising the risk. Now, what the court held was that they couldn't have reasonably known in Rowan. The Ministry of Health could not have reasonably known that the anaesthetic that was used had been contaminated. They couldn't say that they ought reasonably to have known, because it never happened before. You see what I mean? This is something which is completely out of the blue. And one of the things you've got to remember is that accidents happen, and they're not always covered by law. So it's a question of negligence is very important. If there's no way that you ought reasonably to have known that a hazard existed, then you can't ask that also that if there's no ways of eliminating or minimising the risk at the time that it all happens, then it may be that you have done what is reasonably practicable, even though it didn't work. Okay. Don't have to go too much into that. Okay, so D, the availability and suitability of ways to eliminate or minimise the risk, and they may be really problematic. Some things are just very difficult to eliminate risks, but you can still minimise them. So then it goes, and this is where it says it here, after assessing the extent of the risk and the available ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, the costs associated with available ways of eliminating or minimising risk, including whether the cost is grossly disproportionate to the risk, can be taken into account, right? So if you've got, like, if the hazard is getting a splinter in your finger and the risk is that your finger swells up for a day, or needs to have a little operation to pull it out, and the costs associated with it, the only way that you can avoid that in this particular machinery or use of this machinery is by not using wood in it, or recreating wood in a different way that doesn't splinter. And so, including whether the cost is grossly disproportionate to the risk. The risk is minor, but the cost of eliminating that risk is so grossly disproportionate that it's stupid. Then that's where you come to that kind of notion. So there is what is reasonably practicable, and we'll come back to that in time as well. So don't worry too much about that for the moment. So we had a bit of. Did we have a look at primary duty of care? Must ensure, so far as reasonably practical, health and safety of. Yeah, okay. No, we haven't done this one yet, so we will do that next. And I'll finish this just at the moment, and we'll come back to it.